Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU is a leading intellectual force in developing policies that make sure the public interest can counter the power of special interests. Its democracy project is a leader in national efforts to protect voting rights. Myrna Pérez is the deputy director, and she's my guest today.
Hi, thank
Welcome.
you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You have a more optimistic report this year, it seems.
We do. There's been a number of things that have happened as of late that would encourage those who watch what happens in elections. Recently this year, we saw the president...
Before we start, 2012 was the year that a lot of state legislatures became Republican, right?
Well, 2011 and 2012 are notable because we saw the greatest wave of legislation trying to restrict the right to vote pass since the Jim Crow era.
And that came after the census, when the reapportionments happened?
We think that it happened to coincide with the upcoming presidential election. So we saw a wave of restrictive legislation sweep from coast to coast, and we saw the public push back. We saw the public and their advocates and the Department of Justice all step in and challenge this legislation that had passed. And in the end, most of the most restrictive laws ended up not going into effect before the 2012 election. We also saw an increase in turnout among certain populations that had been targeted or potentially targeted for this legislation. And we hope that the message has gotten very clear that voter suppression, or the act of preventing people from getting to the polls, is not a good business model for politicians. The public does not want politicians manipulating the rules of the game to decide who can be in and who can be out. And so we've seen a number of very encouraging developments. One, the Presidential Commission on Election Administration issued a far-reaching and cutting-edge report about what sort of reforms we need in order to make sure that voting is free, fair, and accessible.
And that's not even questionable. The president said after the election that he was going to do this, that nobody should be denied a vote.
He said we had to fix this when he saw it, when he heard about the long lines.
And so he appointed these two election lawyers.
Well, he appointed these two election lawyers, Ben Ginsburg and Bob Bauer, who were the leading campaign lawyers for the Romney and the Obama campaign, to head up the commission. But it was also staffed with experts from Disney, from election officials in the states and at the local level. And they heard hearings all across the country from voters and from academics and from technologists and from other election experts that gave advice about what needed to be done to improve the way our country administers its elections. And the report they came out with was one that had a lot of common sense solutions and suggested things that I think most people would agree with, like voters shouldn't have to wait more than 30 minutes in order to be able to vote, and that we should use technology to try and make sure that the best tools are available to election administrators when they're trying to serve the public. So that was one very encouraging aspect, especially when you consider that it was bipartisan in nature, and no one can accuse Ben Ginsburg of being a rhino or the same of Bob Bauer. The other incredibly encouraging thing was that the Voting Rights Act, which I think your viewers will remember, suffered an enormous blow in June of 2013 because the Supreme Court issued the decision in Shelby County, which eviscerated its most effective protection, had an amendment introduced, and that amendment was bipartisan. We had, Sensenbrenner and Leahy and a bunch of other folks sign on to this bipartisan bill to try and amend the Voting Rights Act, which I think goes to show that people understand that the right to vote and the right to be free from discrimination when voting is something very foundational to our country. And then most recently, we did an analysis of what kinds of bills are being introduced in state legislatures. And in the beginning of the year, more states are introducing legislation that would expand the right to vote
than the ones to restrict it. There are still some states that have the restrictions.
Sure, and there's a worry that some of the restrictive legislation will pass, but we had a vast majority of the introduced legislation be expanding the right to vote. It was about 190 to 49.
It's amazing. So what are the things, what I've never understood is the states are able to What are the federal standards other than the discrimination?
Well, it depends upon the law that you're talking about. We do have the National Voter Registration Act, which is called, Motor Voter.
Right.
You may hear of that, and
Yeah.
that sets forth certain protections for getting registered and for staying on the rolls. We have the Help America Vote
Well, what
Act.
kind of protections does it have, since they do purge the rolls?
It sets forth timetables by which people can be purged. It sets what kind of information they're allowed to use. It describes the manner in which the purges can happen, but also it has affirmative things on it. It requires the DMVs and public service agencies to provide registration services. It sets forth certain record-keeping requirements that require people, require the polls to be made open to people that want to go and take a look at it and inspect it. It requires the ability for voter registration organizations to be able to use the federal form so that there's a common application that can apply. So there's a number of protections there. The Help America Vote Act does a number of things. I mean, one of the most voter protective thing that it does is set forth something called provisional balloting, which means that if a voter presents themselves on election day and there's a dispute about whether or not the voter can register, is registered to vote, they can sign a provisional ballot that will get counted after the fact if it turns out that the person is eligible and should have been registered.
And it must do something with absentee ballots? I don't know, does it?
Absentee
That's
ballots
such
is like a
thing.
different creature
So
of state law.
what are some of the recommendations that the President's Commission made?
Oh, no, I mean, there's a number of really exciting ones.
Yeah, they're about registration, for instance?
Some of them are about registration, some of them are on election day. For example, one of the things they suggested was they should offer more pre-election day opportunities to register to vote. We might call that early voting. They also suggested that at the polling site there be technology like electronic poll books so that people can manage the influx of voters a little better and to be able to see where a voter might have moved or where a voter might have come from to see if they were on the roll, if there's a problem with the election. I did talk about the 30-minute line. They want to look at queuing systems. They want to be able to provide voters more information about what the polling locations look like and when it's getting crowded and help voters make common sense choices about when they want to go and try to vote. It also sets forth a system of transferring information digitally. One of the big problems with our system of registering voters is we put too much emphasis on paper. So, under a typical circumstance, if you wanted to go register when you were at the Department of Motor Vehicles, you'd go in, they'd ask you, do you want to register to vote? You'd say yes. You'd have to fill it out on a piece of paper. That paper would be collected with other registration forms that have to get mailed over to the election office, and then someone would have to hand enter it in. The information is already in the computer system at the DMVs. That information should be electronically transferred.
DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Or the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, whatever it's called in that state. That information should be electronically sent over. So those are the kinds of suggestions that they made. And one of the things that I found so encouraging was that the commission said that our voting problems, our election problems, were identifiable and solvable. That, although we had states that have different rules and different customs, there was still common ground that, could be implemented that would help all voters. And that was one of the things that I think is really encouraging.
It didn't address the question of voter ID, did it?
No, it stayed out of that issue, didn't mention the issue of the Voting Rights Act, those sorts of things.
But in New York State, I mean, we could do a lot, right?
There's certainly a lot that can be done. There's certainly a lot.
The registration, the voting more often, everything.
Our ballots are very confusing and hard to find. One of the recommendations had to deal with ballot design and about making sure that things were legible and that they weren't too long. These are very common sense, solutions that many people would agree with, and it was very nice that they cataloged it and put it as a benchmark for states to try and ascribe to.
So when are we going to see states do it? And they don't have to do it by legislation,
No,
do
they don't. Not all states. I mean, it depends upon what the peculiarity is. We think states are going to start doing it now. There's already legislation moving that we're finding very encouraging. We're very closely monitoring what's happening in the states, and there's some bills that are already starting to move. But you raised a very good point. Sometimes out of the executive offices, we can have folks do things. In New York, we took great steps to digitally transfer information from the DMVs to the election offices, and that was something done at the executive level. Lots of states can do things like that. And as states start looking at things like online registration and electronic transfer of information and early voting opportunities and the use of poll books, more and more states will be able to look and see what other states have done and to be able to get the benefits that other states have
I read
done.
the other day that New York City, the ballots are going to be better, that they're going to be larger print and everything. Who makes that decision, the local Board of Elections or the state?
There's state law that requires what needs to go on the ballots, but there's a lot of things that can be done. For example, we could hire usability experts that would look at it and say, you know what, it's going to be impossible for people to read here or to read there. Sometimes it depends upon, how many ballot initiatives are on or how many parties are running, and there's a requirement that it needs to be in language for people that are limited in English. So I don't want to make it sound like there's no constraints, but there's certainly a lot that can be done and a lot that can be improved. I mean, the ballots were so small in the font last time that I'm surprised
I went to
anybody
vote.
able to read it.
They assigned me into a little cubicle where there was no light. They hand you the ballot, and then they hand you this magnifying sheet. I couldn't
You
see
practically
a thing.
needed a microscope,
It was
right?
so crazy. And then you don't want to, so you argue with them. What good is that going to do? And then you start with the whole thing. So I'm just thrilled that you're optimistic. Do you think that none of the elections this year will reflect these changes most likely? Or
Well,
will they?
it depends on when the elections are happening. I mean, in some states, some of the things are going to be able to be done quickly. I mean, for example, some of the technological use, just a matter of buying them and configuring them and getting them to be tested and phased in. Other states are going to need legislation to do some of the reforms. It is one of these situations where it's going to depend upon the reform that's being picked and what the infrastructure is like in the states. But having said that, this is a very positive move forward, and I think it suggests some really important momentum about the right to vote. I mean, it suggests that there is a growing awareness that the right to vote is fundamental, that it is foundational, and that we as a democracy are better off when we have more of our citizens participating. And so I believe with the Voting Rights Act introduction, which was bipartisan, the Commission's report, which was bipartisan, and this legislative move that we see happening in states, there will become an increasing recognition that we as a country don't want to restrict people from voting.
So our political leaders will finally develop the statesmanship abilities that they're supposed to have to realize this is a fundamental constitutional right?
I mean, I'm hoping that they will, and I'm hoping that those that disagree with that will recognize that it's a bad business practice to try and restrict the right to vote. That
It's going to come back at them.
Well, and also that the arc of American history, like we throughout our history have expanded the right to vote. We've allowed more people to come into the system. And 2011, 2012 was a departure from that, but hopefully the course is writing itself.
That would be a big help. Are there still some important lawsuits in some of the states?
Oh, there are still some going.
Yeah.
There's a photo ID lawsuit in Texas. There's one in Wisconsin. There's one in Pennsylvania. There are more coming. And with the elimination of the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, we have to be vigilant about what's happening at the local level. What is not going to make it, in the front pages of the New York Times, but the moving the polling locations to a place that nobody knew about, the canceling of elections, the reducing 4 polling locations to 1. Those are the stuff that we need to keep an eye on.
So how do you do that?
We partner with a bunch of different organizations, both at the national and the state level. We try to provide education to folks on the ground about what sort of things to look out for, and we ask them to sound the alarm when they start seeing something that doesn't smell right.
And do you go into a different mode on Election Day?
Yes and no. I mean, in a lot of ways, my job is great in that 365 days a year I'm able to think about voters. But on Election Day, we very frequently partner with a nonpartisan coalition called Election Protection, where we try and take phone calls from voters who are having trouble on Election Day. But there's always some of us that are still in the office making sure that we can provide the public education that we need.
Are you working on campaign finance, or is that?
Yeah, that's not my area.
That's not your area, but that is an area that Brennan Center is
certainly,
involved in.
certainly.
And it's a very important area, right?
Certainly, and there's work being done in New York State, and there are plenty of people in my office that'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Well, it's the whole voting. I mean, if you're going to vote, you have to get to the polls to vote. the important question is getting on the ballot. So did the commission address that at all, or is that state
The
thing?
idea of candidate?
Yeah, getting
was
on
more
a ballot.
this was more from a voter's perspective. Like,
Right.
how do we as a country provide good customer service to voters?
Yeah.
You know, ballot access laws in different states are, you know, complicated and confusing, but candidates generally, you know, find the lawyers that they need to be able to help them out.
Yeah, so that's, what would you call, I mean, so you got campaign finance, you got voter access, what would that be?
I would call that like a ballot access, candidate access laws.
And that's not made by parties, it's made by the
It's a
legislature?
creature of state law, but there's also different party rules for who elevates to the top, and they have their own rules regarding primaries and that sort of
Do
thing.
you remember the first time you voted?
I remember the first time I voted in person, and I also remember the first time I stepped into a voting booth. I remember going with my aunt on my way to school, and I think that's really important. I think we as a country need to do more to educate our young people about the importance of voting and why we need to do it. And that raises an issue that wasn't covered by the commission, but the idea of restricting the voting rights of people with criminal convictions. Those laws have you know, enormous consequences from a racial perspective in terms of who is disenfranchised. And when you have communities where the adults in that community can't vote, their children don't
vote.
have the role models. They don't have someone taking them to the polls.
Right.
They don't have someone instilling in them the value of going out to vote.
But we also have a lot of people who just don't use that right, don't vote.
We do, we
Yeah.
do.
I remember the first time I went into a polling place, and I want to tell you, it was in 1936, and I was 4 years old, but it's something that I did every 4 years with my mother.
That's wonderful.
You know, one election she wouldn't let me in, and she wouldn't tell me who she voted. It was Wilkie and Roseville. I'll never forgive her for that. And by the time I asked her, she couldn't remember. But that also goes back to the lack of teaching about the importance. So when did you realize? I mean, when did you choose this profession?
I've loved voting and the concept of voting.
Isn't that
and
interesting?
For you know, since I was 19 years old. You know, I mean, I think it's the right to vote, as the great civil rights historian Taylor Branch said, is a little piece of nonviolence. It's the way we
Yeah,
resolve
it's
our
wonderful.
political differences. And I think when we come together as a community and cast our vote and say that that is how we're going to resolve our political differences, it says something very profound about us as a country. It says something very, it is both very real, but at the same time very aspirational about how we are willing to put our faith in a process and be able to live with the results and be able to say that I matter and this is how I matter.
Isn't that interesting that you developed that? Did you come from a family that was voting on a regular basis?
My parents were immigrants. My father was naturalized when he was signed up for the Vietnam War, and my mother didn't actually vote till I was in college. But you know, it's something that she regularly does now, and it's something that I think is really important. I already take my 19-month-old son with me to go and vote. You know, we're very well known in our polling location. You know, and I always thank the people that are, you know, handing out flyers to for at least caring enough to back a candidate.
Because nothing is discouraging as people who pass you by when you're trying to hand them a piece of, just nothing is discouraging. You want to just get so angry and say something and do something. Did you have a civics course in high school?
I did. I had a great.
I think that that's a very, very important thing. I had civics in junior high school, and that was just the thing that just grew my interest in it so much. But I don't think they teach that very much now in public schools.
I mean, I don't have a child that's old
Yeah,
enough for
you haven't
public school
gotten there
yet.
yet.
I haven't gotten
Yeah.
there yet, but you know, I think that's something that's incredibly important. And when we're looking at what it is that we need our young people to have for the future, a good amount of civic literacy and a good civic education is really
Yeah,
right up there.
It's incredibly. So did you, there have been other bills introduced in the legislature, haven't there, in the Congress, that would add things to voting, haven't there, other than the ones we discussed, or were they all campaign finance?
So there has been something called the Voter Empowerment Act, which would set forth a series of reforms. I mean, one of the things that I think is really exciting about what is happening now is that we have an effort to try and improve the nuts and bolts of election administration, how it is that people get on the rolls, how it is that they get good customer service on election day, and then we have something that is designed to fulfill the promise that we make to every American, that when they step into the ballot box, they will be free from discrimination. They are both critically important. They're both happening at the same time. One does not supplant the other, and we need them both. We need both of those promises to our country, to our citizens. And the fact that they're both happening right now, I think, is very
Makes
very
you really happy. You're very excited. What are there different agencies that participate in this effort? Who runs the actual voting part of it?
That's done at the state level, state and local level.
No, but I mean in the federal government. Who is there to see that the voting right, not the voting rights, the HAWA, whatever you call it, I've forgotten.
There's a federal agency called the Election Assistance Commission that currently does not have any commissioners.
Members.
Yes, it doesn't have any members. But there's a markup for that later this week.
Have there been people nominated for it?
There have been.
And the Congress hasn't approved?
At
the Senate?
That's right, at this time.
And what is the overall department that's in?
It is an independent agency, so it's the Election Assistance Commission is an independent
And then
agency.
it's the Justice Department?
The Justice Department is responsible for in addition to implementing things like the National Voter Registration Act and that sort of stuff, it is the chief enforcer of our anti-discrimination laws.
It's an incredible operation, isn't it?
It is.
And that comes down to us through the U.S. Attorney's Office in a region or not?
Well, the U.S. attorneys will have a role depending upon what the state is like, but the Department of Justice does have people that they send out to monitor and to do other things when they're needed.
When there are court cases, does the Brennan Center actually send an attorney into the court?
Well, it depends on what our involvement is. We are an intervener in the Texas matter, so we have a big team on that. We're partnering with a pro bono law firm. We have other co-counsel that are with us on our team, and we have we're going to end up being before a Corpus Christi judge later this week.
Are you going to go?
I will not go, but there will be there will be a member of our team that will go. And right now, I have 2 lawyers in Wichita for another matter. So we do get involved in that way, and we do try really hard to add value to the legislation that is happening. I think right now with the Shelby County decision being something we all have to contend with, and there not being a functioning Section 5.
What is that? The Shelby County?
That was a Supreme Court decision in June of 2013.
The one taking the section out.
Taking Section 5, making it inoperable. We are in a real lawmaking moment right now, and we need to make sure that the rest of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act are being applied fairly, and that they are able to hold the line against acts of discrimination until we get that Voting Rights Act amendment passed.
What's the case in Texas?
It's a photo identification case. The photo ID law there was very, it was very interestingly designed in that if you had a concealed gun license, you could use that to vote, but you couldn't vote if you had your University of Texas or your Texas A&M student ID card. And there is, good data about the fact that there are going to be a number of eligible Americans that are not going to have the kind of ID that is required. And to be very clear, the question of whether or not an ID, a photo ID law is problematic, it's a very on-the-ground, fact-intensive inquiry where you look at what sort of identification is allowed, what happens if you don't have that identification, what kind of identification does the population have. There's no one-size-fits-all model about whether or not a photo ID law is acceptable or not. But in this instance, there's very, very good reason, and we believe that we will prove in court that there are too many burdens on the right to vote being experienced by eligible Americans.
The basic foundation and supposed reason for these is fraud?
Yeah.
Let's talk about fraud. a very small percentage, right?
Well, I mean, there's different kinds of fraud, but the only kind of voter fraud that a photo ID law would stop would be somebody going in pretending to be someone else. And that is extraordinarily rare for a number of reasons. One, it doesn't work very well. Like you're talking about changing one or two votes and risking, enormous criminal penalties for having done that. And then it requires like a great deal of coordination and an operation to be able to make sure that you'll get away with it. I mean, it's generally something that's extraordinarily rare. It's extraordinarily rare, and and those kinds of laws make it really difficult to try and actually fix the problem that they have. There's no dispute that our elections need to be full of integrity and that people need to have trust in them. But we need to strike an appropriate balance between making sure that that we can have confidence in our elections and that there are not too many barriers in front of the ballot box that don't really serve a good function and aren't really helpful to accomplishing that aim.
Well, I hope that you come back, let's say, after the elections, or how much time?
Anytime you
all
ask
right,
me.
but when do you think we're going to have the really good news that all of these things are happening?
Well, the legislative sessions are going to be running through, so we'll know some more. When they start closing, toward the summer, we'll see how many good bills actually got passed and how many bad bills got passed, and hopefully, before 2015, we'll know how some of the photo ID laws turned out by their states, and hopefully by that point,
2016, we'll have everybody, as many as people possible, voting for President of the United States. Thank you very much, Myrna.
Thank you so much.
And lots of good luck. And
Thank you.
We're in safe hands, I think, with you and the Brennan Center.
Thank you so much. It's very
Thank
kind
you.
of you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.